you're good to go.
Okay. Where's the microphone, just so I know if I'm standing back here or, you know,
I think it's up
up
here.
there with that?
Yeah, so you should be good.
So people can
Here
hear.
and here, yeah. Everyone should be able to hear. And you can move this around.
Yeah, you know what I might do? Let's see.
Yeah.
Reach down. There,
Yeah.
for myself, so I can look at everybody.
You're welcome. Guys, enjoy.
Thank you. How's everybody doing? So I'm curious. Has anybody here done a land transaction?
I have done once.
Okay. Tell us what it was, what that was like, size and.
Oh, it's, I can't even remember. I sold one in Macon
Uh-huh.
a few years back. I don't remember anything about it.
Okay. Was it small though, or was it large? It
It's
was
pretty small. It's meant for residential,
Perhaps.
yeah, for a house.
Okay. So y'all came today. What do you want to get out of this session?
I need to buy land.
You need to buy land?
My builders need to buy land.
Okay. Your daughter needs to buy land.
My builder,
Your builder.
my builders.
So you're working with a builder. Okay.
Yeah.
Not yet?
I already sold one a few years ago, and it was easy, but I don't feel comfortable doing that transaction because I didn't know if I did everything correctly.
Right.
And then thanks God that until today, everything is doing well.
Uh-huh.
And also I listed two lots and
Okay.
I couldn't sell it. So
Okay.
I really need to find out, I mean,
You need to
what should I
understand the
do?
process.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
I would like to talk about pricing, how to price raw land, like what resources do you use in order to get an idea of the value?
Okay.
And the forms, like I'm kind of real rusty on the forms to use instead of like a F-101 or F-201. Yeah.
The regular purchase and sale agreement. Yeah. There is a land purchase document in the GAR database in .loop, or I don't know if you guys are still using .loop. I still pay for .loop because old habits are hard to break. But there is a GAR form for land, and I can even pull that up. And then how about you?
Thinking in the future, I want to buy some land.
For yourself?
Yes.
As an investment? Okay. Okay, so first of all, my name's Janet. So I haven't met all of you. Some of you I have, but I don't come to the office very much these days ever since COVID. So I'm a commercial agent. Kathy Radler and I are partners, so we do our commercial transactions together. Everything that we do in the commercial world, we share. So I came from a corporate setting in the Post Properties corporate office. Post Properties doesn't exist anymore, but they were a multifamily developer that started here in Atlanta. John Williams started that company back in the 70s. They were known for their beautiful landscaping. That, like, when you drove past a Post property, you knew it was Post property because of the landscaping. That was the thing that
Is
set
it
them apart.
apartments?
It's apartments or
I have
multifamily.
seen
Yeah.
those communities.
So they did really nice garden, what we call garden style properties back in the 70s. And garden style means that you've got multiple buildings, right, with multiple apartment units, but everything is spread out. So the parking is all what we refer to as surface parking. And you've got your amenities like the tennis courts and your swimming pool and the clubhouse area. That started to evolve over the years. And so now, especially in Midtown or down in Buckhead, you'll see there are different types of multifamily products that can be a podium style, which means that it's got structured parking. The parking sits under the apartment complex, so it's a tower. It can be a wrap product where you've got a couple of buildings that are attached to that parking structure, and the apartment units, those buildings wrap the parking structure. So that's the reason they refer to it as a wrap product. So I had a good network because of that experience. And ultimately, when I got my license, probably 7 years ago now, I started in commercial and I actually started in healthcare because I had a background in medical device sales. And then from there, I ended up here at Keller. I did residential for, I think it was 2 years. And because I had a non-compete, so I was honoring my non-compete. And I went back to commercial because that was my thing. So what I did though, in this presentation, just so you guys know, is I geared it toward really more of a residential focus because commercial is a lot more complicated. If you want to do commercial, you want to get set up as a commercial agent, here's to have the right tools. It costs a lot more money. My monthly bill is probably $600 roughly for all my tools. So it's a lot of money. And then the lead time is a much longer lead time. And we closed a big deal last year in Gwinnett County that was 52 acres with a multifamily guy. Ultimately, there's going to be 799 apartment units on that property. They're doing it in 2 phases. We were supposed to go under contract. This is just to sort of give you an idea how commercial works. We were supposed to go under contract. This was in December. We were told to follow up in January. Followed up in January, and at the 11th hour, a prior buyer came forward and decided they were going to buy the entire property. We were looking at buying half of it, which is all they were looking at selling at the time. We competed, but we really were not given a fair shot at the competition. And that happens. That's where commercial gets kind of hairy. It's a little more cutthroat in that regard. That said, they went under contract with the other buyer that had come forward. We chased them for another 1.5 years, where there was nurturing the relationship, tracking with them, where are they in their contract, because in my gut, I knew it was gonna fall apart because their buyer, all they did was decide they were gonna tie up the entire piece of property to squeeze us out. So ultimately, they got sideways with one another, contract went south, we came back to the table. And this is 1.5 years later, almost 2 years later, we went under contract and it took us another year before we closed it, but we closed it. So it takes a lot of persistence if you're working on bigger land opportunities in a commercial setting. So I set this up so that I felt like it would help you more in the residential world. We can talk a little bit about commercial if you have questions, but just know that's what's going into this, okay? Okay. So I was gonna pull mine up here, so I'm not trying to look behind me. Sorry, guys.
Are we allowed to take pictures of your notes?
Sure, and I'm happy to actually email it and share it with you guys.
Thanks.
I put it together for y'all, so. Okay, so there's a lot of things to consider when you're looking to either represent a buyer or a seller in a land transaction. The first obvious thing is you gotta locate the land, right? What does the client need? Or if you've got a seller, you gotta figure out how are you gonna list it? And this goes to the comps that you were talking about a minute ago. So there are multiple ways you can use a system that's called GIS, which is a geographic information system. Every municipality has GIS, and GIS is something that, the little trivia, it's been around for, I think, like hundreds of years. There was an epidemic of, I think it's called chlorea, much like COVID, many years ago. And the way they tracked it was by determining the population and identifying where the outbreak had initially occurred. And what they quickly realized was it was an outbreak that occurred near water. So it was a bacteria that was transferred through water contact. So that said, it's a technology that's been around for many years, but it's a technology that now we have at our fingertips because of the internet. And so GIS is something that developers often use. You were talking about your builders. They may use this same system. So GIS will tell you a lot of things. Parcel identification number, the owner's name and address. It'll give you zoning information. It'll even tell you the last sales price, and the purchase amount, the sales date and the purchase amount. It gives you an idea of the topography, because topography is a concern when you're dealing with a land transaction. Aerial view, it'll even show you easements. So a lot of developers will use GIS because it's a quick way for them to figure out where are the utilities? Are the utilities close by? Is there sewer available? And where is it located? It can be very expensive if you have to pull utilities or sewer to your site. It can be like $150,000, because it's not just the cost of running the utilities sometimes, depending on the location. As an example, if you did something down in the Buckhead area, they've got to shut that road down.
Janet, can you share your screen, please? We can't see it on the Zoom.
Well, you get, okay, hang on. Let me grab Billy, because I think he was supposed to do that. Hold on.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
I didn't realize there were more people on Zoom.
Well, maybe they advertise this class as a be in person only, so that's why I was like, no.
Oh, I
Um,
thought-
what?
I'm not sure.
I
thought it was in person.
Oh, okay, I thought that it was.
But then it's text, see. Oh,
Oh, okay.
Share screen, the green.
You want the
Slides.
the slides.
Touched it. So we should just go quick. Okay, so just scroll down. Okay.
Yeah, you can use the arrows.
Yeah. Okay. Can y'all see that now?
Yes, thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Thanks for late. Well,
Yes, thank you.
So I just was saying, for example, so, and this can happen if you're purchasing a lot, right? That if the utilities and the sewer that you need, it's there at the corner, but you gotta get it down the street to your property. There's a cost, not just to run it, but if it's a 2-lane road, that road's gotta be shut down. So that cost gets incorporated. Somebody's gotta pay for those workers to stand out there and direct traffic in addition to the work that's being done to actually get it to the site. So those are things to know and be aware of.
There's a map on Cobb Assessor's website. Is that the closest to GIS?
So Cobb County has their own GIS that you can click on, and you can usually search GIS with the county name. And you can also call that municipality and they will help you. They're usually very helpful. So there's a big learning curve with GIS. Even today, I still struggle with it because Gwinnett's GIS system works a little differently than Cobb County's. And you get into issues sometimes with your cache where things have been stored in your memory and the browser needs that stuff to be cleared out. So it can be quirky, but I shared this link, www.esri.com is a link where you can go and actually learn more detailed information about GIS. And if you really want to get proficient with it, you could put in your own address or address here at the office and play around with it. So the other thing is to know that not all GIS systems are updated like it should be. So it's a resource, it's a great tool, but
It's not
it,
the Bible.
it did right. It's not the Bible. So
How
there's-
is Cherokee County?
Theirs seems to be pretty good. Cobb County seems to be pretty good, and so does Gwinnett. So, and just, when you're in doubt, always pick up the phone and call somebody and ask them. But these are the same tools. Oh, these are the same tools that, okay, it's not moving. Back up. There we go. These are the same tools that developers use. We use these as a commercial agent. And this is an image that I thought would be really helpful for you to sort of understand how GIS works. It works in layers. So when you're looking at GIS, when you're in that program, there are different boxes that you can click on to turn those layers on and off. And so the further you drill down, the more detailed information you get. The one that I have as an example here, I thought was really good. City of Delta, I think that's in Colorado, and that's the reason I used it. You guys are welcome to pull that one up as well, but any GIS system is good to play with. So when you're thinking about trying to identify comps, for example, if you're representing a seller, GIS is not necessarily what we use for that. We tend to use CoStar. So as a commercial agent, we subscribe. That's one of the tools we get is CoStar. Crexi is a free account. Anybody can look at information on Crexi. You can run comps in both of those systems for land purchases, but you can also look at that information in FMLS and in Georgia MLS. And if you're struggling to find comps, if you really want to drill down a little further, go to the realist tax. It might take a little bit of time, but you could generate a report for a particular area or subdivision if there's a lot or two that's been left over, and sort of see what the comps have been in that area. So it's really important when you're working on a land transaction, you really need to work with a contractor or an architect, somebody that understands the process, because at the end of this presentation, you're going to see there's a lot to understand, but it's not necessarily that these are the things that we do as an agent for our client, whether it's a buyer or a seller. Some of these things we need to do, but more importantly is understanding that process and having the right person in place to help guide you along with the client that you're representing. And oftentimes people will look for a piece of land to build a house on, and they don't understand that just because it's a 1 acre piece of property doesn't mean you can come build the house of your dreams on that 1 acre, because there may be restrictions that apply to that property that go beyond just setback rules. And we'll talk about those in a little bit.
Where and on the GIS, when you're doing the layers, does that tell you distances? Can you measure distances, like how far from
From a creek.
well, from a creek, but more importantly, how far from services? So let's say there's an awesome piece of land, 5 acres, and someone came out and said, oh yeah, here, you could put the house here, right? Because sometimes you can't put it right up against the road or whatever, right? And then you gotta say, all right, cool, my house is gonna cost me $400,000 to build. And you're like, yeah, but you have to get water to it. Right, so to go into where water is available, where maybe or maybe not sewer is available, or electricity.
Yeah, so I want to say there is a line, much like the old maps that we used to do, that is for distance, that give you a reference point so you can get an idea of how far it is. It's been a while since I've looked and paid attention to that, but I'm pretty sure.
But it's a lot to get services to particular places.
Especially
It can-
sewer.
Yeah.
So it can crush a deal, guys, because if you're trying to do a buyer, if you're trying to represent a buyer, for example, that cost has to be considered in the offer that you're putting together. So it's part of why it's really important to have an understanding of some of these things before you put together an offer.
Because where they think they want to put the house and, mom goes out there and she puts some little piece of tape around, this is where we want it, and then all of a sudden you find out that's the only place they can put the septic.
Right.
You're like,
And depending on the size of the house, how big's the septic system gotta be? We'll talk about that too. But that takes up part of your land. You cannot put a structure on top of a septic tank. So that's another challenge. So when you identify a piece of land that's not listed, for example, obviously you've got to track down the owner. So some of the ways that we do that, and some of this may be redundant for you, but we look for them on Realist Tags. Kathy and I subscribe to Been Verified, so we can look people up. It gives us their emails, their phone numbers. It's not always right. Usually there's a list of phone numbers, but somewhere in there you can get to them. It'll even oftentimes include social media, so you can start looking at their social media information. Another good way, and we've had to do this before, is go talk to the neighbor. Neighbors often know a lot. So just knock on somebody's door, you'll get there, right? So next, really, this I did a lot on because survey is so important. Residential, we don't typically get a survey for our buyers, right? Usually you're in a subdivision, things are already established and most people feel kind of safe, but we've seen situations, I know Kathy's had a situation where she was representing someone and there was a fence that was encroaching. So it's always good, actually, even in the residential world, to get a survey, but particularly if you're dealing with land, you should do a survey. It'll define the property boundaries. A survey needs to disclose any improvements you want to make, whether it's now or in the future. You can ask the seller if they have a survey. That survey can be shared in the market materials with the permission of the seller. Surveys can be copyrighted, so they can be the property of the surveyor. If the seller has a survey, you can often have a survey updated. There are different types of surveys. In our world, most of our developers work with, they need an ALTA. They need something that's very defined with a lot of detail that shows all the things we've already talked about with regard to sewer and utilities. And so it's not just about the outline of the property. It's something that explains where they can build so they can put together their plan for the structure or structures that they're going to put on this property. So surveys record the elevations, the borders, the angles, of course, any man-made or natural structures on the property. So surveys are not always recorded in the clerk's office. They can be, and if you're buying a survey or if your client is buying a survey, if they want it recorded in the clerk's office, which is a good idea to do, they need to tell the surveyor up front. There's an additional cost for that. But the process changes a little bit because they need to be able to comply with that municipality's requirements. If there's a certificate that they require or any other documentation, it gets done as they're doing the survey. So that's kind of an important detail.
What's the benefit of recording a survey?
I would say it kind of puts people on notice, right? It's public record at that point. So that's probably the biggest benefit in my mind. There may be other benefits, but one other benefit could be that if it's needed in the future and the seller doesn't, or the owner doesn't have it, you've got a place you can go pull it from. Right?
What's the benefit for seller to record it?
they don't lose it.
They don't lose it, yeah.
So that happens a lot. All of
Yeah.
a sudden, well, it was my grandfather's land and he gave it to me and, chain of titles there. But you're like, yeah, it's always past that oak tree over there. And then a storm like last night comes through 10 years ago, that oak tree's gone.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, I think it was right around there.
And if one of your neighbors encroaches on your property, will that help?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We used to, I keep interrupting,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. But we used to, like in the 90s, now I'm dating myself, But when you closed on a property in Georgia in the 90s, part of that closing was a survey. I don't know when, because I got into lending then, and I don't know when it went away, because I moved from Georgia to California in like 97, but it was, you always had to have a survey.
Yeah. And I think it should be required. After some experience now as an agent, I think it should be required. And this hits on why. So why is a survey important? It can provide, so a surveyor, actually, the guy doing the survey can provide excellent guidance and a lot of information about the property to help ensure that the land is utilized to its fullest benefit, its highest and best use, right? The surveying the land helps prevent any legal problems down the road. It doesn't just determine the property line, but it determines your neighbor's property line. This helps to identify any violations with a neighbor. I have a mortgage guy who's a commercial mortgage guy who called me probably a month or two ago on a Sunday night. And he said, my neighbor wants me to move my fence. My fence is on my neighbor's property. And he don't want to move it. So now, so he said, do I have to move it? And I said, well, it depends on what the neighbor does. And he said, but if it's been there and it was there when I bought the house, who's responsible? He said, isn't it mine now? And I said, well, there certainly is adverse possession. Y'all remember that term? It's been being utilized openly for a number of years now, but it's not just that it's been utilized that way. It has to be challenged. And so potentially he could go to court and he doesn't like his neighbor. So he's kind of inclined to basically not giving back his property, but they could go to court over it. And if he can prove adverse possession, then he could get, he could basically take ownership, legal ownership then of that other guy's property. And it was a significant piece of property from what he said. So another reason that surveys are good, right?
Fence companies will ask you to.
Yes. I had one done on my house when I bought my house because we needed to put up a fence. So we had it marked to make sure that there were no issues. Interesting tidbit, a survey is legally binding for 10 years after completion and recording in the court recorder's office. It's given a life of 10 years to ensure that the surveyor that charted the land is liable if there are any discrepancies or calculations that are found to be wrong. I didn't know that. And what's interesting about a survey is that the survey is good for the person that had it done. So any insurance that you have with that piece of paper in your hand, right, is yours if you paid for that survey. If you did not, that protection does not transfer to a new owner. I thought that was interesting. So if a survey is doing a survey for a construction site, for example, they don't just focus on the land limits and the boundaries. That surveyor will collaborate with the other stakeholders that are involved in this transaction. It's another reason that it's good to have done. That can be civil engineering, it can be architect, it could be anybody that's involved, which is going to help ensure that the goal of your client, if you're representing a buyer, for example, the goal of whatever they want to accomplish with that land should be successful after closing. That's the worst thing that could happen, is that you have to represent a client, you close on a piece of property only to realize that they can't build what they wanted to build, right? So that's the pitfall that you really want to avoid. Another note that I think is worth sharing is, as an agent for us, if you're representing a buyer particularly, and you find that there's an issue, number one, they either don't want to do a survey, or number two, they want to move forward on a property that has a known problem with a survey, you probably should get them to sign a waiver or some sort of electronic trail that can prove if there's anything, because things can come back on us, right? So you want to protect that you did your job as an agent and you disclosed that there was an issue or that you advised them to get a survey and they decided they didn't want to spend the extra money to do it. Surveys can range from $500 on up to thousands of dollars, depending on the property, depending on the surveyor and the type of survey that's being done.
I closed the house last Friday. I think there was a piece of paper saying that, surveys are not required. So it's not part of this contract. That's to
Yeah.
protect the attorney. I think.
That's to protect the attorney, but as an agent, I think it's good to get your client to acknowledge that you have advised them that it's in their best interest to get a survey. And they've chosen not to. Or you can have a situation, for example, I know somebody that was trying to buy a house recently and they've done an addition to the home. One corner of this addition was over a sewer line. You can't build over those type of structures underground. So
You have a setback. Like,
That's right.
or something.
So it means it's got to be adjusted. It's got to either be torn down, the structure's got to be modified, because at some point, somebody's going to have to get to that sewer access, right? So if things like that can come up, when I was doing my research and sort of putting this together for you guys, I actually read an example where somebody had a survey done on a piece of property, looked like a great property. Come to find out, there was a house that literally sat on, the center of the house was on the property line. Yeah. It was a hot mess, right? Just, there are good reasons to get a survey done.
You don't want to find that out a week before closing.
Or after.
Or-
That's right.
Or after.
That's
really.
right, yeah. And so, as I said earlier, only the owner of the survey is protected in the event of a discrepancy. This also means that when you close on a residential transaction, just as an example, and your client purchases title insurance, that title insurance is going to be restricted to, it's actually going to exclude anything that falls under a survey. I never thought about that, but you're getting title insurance, and in our mind, we sort of feel like, okay, we're protected with whatever goes wrong. It actually protects us against the mortgage. So it doesn't protect everything about that property. So particularly if you're working on a land transaction, it's another good reason, because the title insurance, if the survey is done, the title insurance should protect you for the survey as well.
When you buy land, you should do your own survey.
Yes, we should.
Surveys can find encroachments, but not easements, right?
They can find easements. Mhm,
If they're recorded.
that's correct. And even if they're not recorded, I mean, if the surveyor, depending on the type of survey that you're having done, it can identify those encroachments. Yeah.
Sorry, I got lost. The title insurance can protect the survey as well if the survey is recorded,
If the survey is purchased by the buyer,
purchased by the buyer, okay,
in other words, they're not acquiring ownership of an existing survey. You can't acquire ownership of an existing survey,
Okay.
right?
Mhm.
You got
So
to pay
just
for it.
because you got the papers,
You're not
It's
protected.
just like home inspection report from the previous one.
Yeah.
That's
You
right.
didn't pay for it. You
Okay.
have it, but you didn't pay for it. If
right,
you call the inspector and say, I'm not talking to you.
right.
Right. Yeah,
So, and things change.
they do.
Because this is an easy example. Clark, you live in Indian Hills, right? So when they put that new pipe that went all the way through Indian Hills, it took like, what, 3 years of doing that and everything? And they had to purchase land from a lot of people. Some people, it was only like 2 feet of land, but like part of the golf course, I mean, I know Indian Hills made like $3 million, right? Because, you know, like they needed the money too, right? But so all those people right? Where you might have had an easement that was maybe a 8-foot easement because it was a small pipe. Now they put a pipe in, it's huge.
Right.
Cobb County had to buy an easement in the back of our property.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just.
And how much,
It wasn't, I wish it was $2 million or $4 million or
Yeah.
whatever, but what's the question?
So like how much land did they?
Not much, it was, they were redoing, the water, it was the water,
Right, yeah.
whatever, Cobb County Water Services.
Right.
And so they paid me like $350 to access
Yeah.
the backside of our property.
But if you had a survey, right, from when you bought it, right, and said, oh, yeah, we got a survey, here you go, and you gave it to them,
Mhm.
the new buyer. What,
You're not protected.
but me as an agent, I'd be like, oh, yeah, here's the survey. I didn't, what you just said is,
That's a big detail. I mean, because to me, that detail translates to the residential world, right? It goes back to what we were talking
yeah,
about.
I never
earlier.
would ask, like, I'd be like, well, the survey says, and,
Yeah.
5 years later, we call Clark's like, well, that was an old survey, they bought whatever from us, and you're like, well, we were gonna put a fire pit back
Yeah.
there, and, whatever. $350, but there's other people that have received 3,000, 10,000, so.
And
And
it's,
that's been there, that neighborhood's been there since 1960.
yeah, long time. So the next topic is deeds. So we know that a deed is referenced by a legal description and it verifies the type of ownership, right? Always review the deed because there are restrictions that can occur inside of a deed, right? Deed restrictions run with the land, so it means that it applies to all future owners of the property when the property is sold. I heard a story about where there was a piece of property that was acquired and there were no known deed restrictions, except that it was discovered that there had been a mistake. And there was supposed to be a deed restriction that didn't carry over from a prior deed. That's a hot mess, right? Because there's this deed restriction that should have run with the land to the new owners that were, I say new owners, the current owner that was now selling this property. And nobody knew about it. And it got uncovered through the due diligence
What was
process.
like an example of a restriction?
So a restriction can be that this property has to be some type of amenity for the community. You know,
Or never to be developed in
or
the
never to
future.
be developed. You, as a homeowner or landowner, can put whatever restriction you want on your deed. If you're passionate about your piece of little heaven that you own and you don't want to see commercial come in there, you could put a restriction.
So I've heard that in some rural areas that used to be rural, Canton, I heard a story that, the Baptist church owned like 100 acres, right?
Mhm.
And they were selling it for, homes to be built on it, but part of it was along Highway 20.
Right,
And a guy was gonna put a commercial piece there with a liquor store. And there was a deed restriction that said, since the Southern Baptist Church owned it, you-
no alcohol.
no alcohol.
You can do that.
And you would never,
Or casino.
or casino, I mean,
Right, so in the commercial world for
that's
us,
a big deal.
yeah, it is a big deal. Now, for us, a lot of times our developers are working with attorneys and our developers don't need real estate agents. They have good attorneys that are researching a lot of this information for them, right? So they've got such a long list of due diligence that they're identifying, but those are the kind of things, we might be working with a small, we call them C-stores. A C-store is just a convenience store with a gas station, right? And we've got clients like that, so we may be working with somebody like that that wants to secure a piece of land. And that needs to be uncovered, and they may be equipped to do it, they may not be, but as an agent, it's very proactive for us to look at the deed and to identify, is there a deed restriction? Because the more you can identify up front, the better the process is when you get down the road, right? Nobody wants to find out a bad detail at the 11th hour when you think you're getting ready to close. and money has been spent to get to this point. So
A lot of money.
a lot of money has been spent, that's right. That's right. Easements and type of restrictions, so there are two types of easements, an easement in gross, which allows someone else to lay power, cable, gas lines, etc. This is like what we were talking about earlier, and often this is referred to as an eminent domain easement. A pertinent easement, that's where you might have two neighboring properties that state that one owner has the right to lay a driveway from their house to the main road to the other's land. So Kathy and I worked on a large assemblage a couple of years ago up in Gwinnett. We call it our Beaufort assemblage. There were a total of 11 homes, 10 that wanted to participate in being assembled for a total of about 90 acres. This property or properties had a lot of moving parts because number one, they're referred to as flag properties. So if you look out from the aerial view, the driveways are very long and they're shared. And so you have this long driveway and you have a house that sits there. So it looks like a flagpole, right? And a flag hanging off of it. Gwinnett County actually wanted to get rid of flag properties because you're sharing access, right? It's not like what we live in our subdivisions today.
Sandy Springs got rid of them, I think.
Yeah,
Doesn't know.
yeah. So the ones that exist, they really like to see them go away. But that's an example. And so you may identify a piece of property that looks like it's a great piece of property, but it may be landlocked. So if it's landlocked and your client's still interested in it, can you negotiate something with the adjacent neighbor so that there's an easement that will always be
And then
there?
there's gotta be a maintenance agreement and
That's right. Yep, somebody's got to maintain it and it's got to be clear who's going to maintain it, whose expense. And how does that get handled? You know, so just some things to consider. Zoning. So this is another big topic. This is a lot of what we deal with in our world and in commercial, but it's true even if you're looking to do a residential opportunity or a single home or maybe a family compound. So the zoning establishes the what and how a property can be used now and in the future. Zoning classifications are not necessarily permanent. There is such a thing as what we call future land use map. So we've talked about the GIS map. Your municipalities also have a future land use where they basically have all gotten together and they've determined what they want this area to look like. And that can mean that there's some rezoning that's automatically going to occur, or it can mean that if you've got a piece of property that you're selling or a buyer that wants to purchase that you're representing, that it might be a good fit for what they want to use. It may align with what the future land use says that property can be used for. So it's always good if you have to call and ask questions about zoning, or if you have to call and ask for assistance about GIS like we were talking about earlier. There are people within that municipality that they can give you a lot of that information. If it's hard for you to figure it out, pick up the phone and call somebody, right? If the property needs to be rezoned, you want to make sure you allow enough time in your contract. So rezoning length of time can vary. We typically see it somewhere in 3 to 6 months, but it can take a while. The process in zoning is that when you go to apply for zoning, you have to file an application. There's an application fee, and there are certain things that have to be included in that application. It used to be that you could just file the application, and then you could go get with your architect or your engineers or whoever you were working with to design a plan, and you'd come back and you'd present an idea. It might not be a final concept, but an idea of what that site is going to look like when you get to build what you desire. Now those packages are done in such a way that when you file, you have to have all that information to go with it. So if you're building a house, for example, you need to know what's going to go there. They need to have a plan that gets attached to that application request, because they're going to review what you're proposing, and things that have to get considered then are going to be the setbacks, exterior finishes, size of the house, how many garages, is the garage front loaded or side loaded? There are a lot of details that municipality is going to implement. And so can you even achieve, this is where, if you're representing a buyer, your buyer may figure out that I want a 5,000 square foot house, I don't want a 3,000 square foot house, right? And then the other piece to consider too is if you're doing a mortgage for this, you don't want to build a $3 million house inside a $1.5 million neighborhood. You'll never get your loan approved unless you've got a buyer that has cash and they're willing to take that risk because they see the area is changing and they think it's coming, it's just not here yet. So that's another important reason to do some of these other things we've already talked about. Sometimes it's necessary to have the zoning attorney handle requests. It just depends on the nature of the project. There's safety in that because a zoning attorney, particularly a zoning attorney that knows that market, can better guide the client in what to ask for, what's going to be allowed, what's likely going to be rejected. So future land use can improve or it can hurt a property's value. Land zoned residential has a lower value than land that's zoned commercial. If a property has an approval for a higher density use, that property gets a higher price point. This talks about, this goes to your question earlier, right? When you're trying to figure out value. So you're not just looking at comps for land that might have sold in the area. You also are going to need to take into consideration what's it approved for, what can it likely be approved for. And we've seen situations where there's a rezoning. Rezonings can automatically occur. We have a contract with a client on Boulder Crest. This is down in DeKalb County. Sweet man, he and his wife are in their 80s and they're kind of ready to ride off into the sunset. They've been in this property for 40 years roughly, maybe a little longer. And it's a dilapidated building, to put it nicely. It's really an eyesore and he knows it's an eyesore, but they have a lot of people that come to them because they sell little farmers market stuff, you know, corn and green beans and things like that. And you go inside and it's kind of like going into CVS where you can find other little tidbits that, you know, people might need. And they know the people in the community. They love this community because they've been such a part of it for so long. And they've contributed to the school systems over the years as their own kids were growing up, and they still donate. So if food's going bad that they can't sell, they'll go donate it to a local shelter. We've gone under contract with somebody who wants to put a C-store on this property, and it's a small site, it's a 2-acre site, only to learn that his property that is today a commercial piece of property, and in its prior life was actually a gas station, and I'll come back to that in a minute, that today his property for the future land use has been zoned residential. They downgraded this man's zoning. So when you start looking at the houses around this property and the price point of those houses, and you start thinking about who's going to want to buy this 2 acres, even if you subdivide it and put a residential house on there, and how much are they going to want to pay? I can assure you, if anybody wants to buy it and build a house on this property, it's going to be way less than what we're contracted for this property as a commercial piece of land. They have just crushed this man's dreams. So hard things to find out in the process. And we found this out after we went under contract. And so we've been under contract for a while. We're still working on it. We've reached out to the commissioner for that district, not really getting anywhere. Now we're having to use an attorney. We actually hired an attorney who did some due diligence to research how they came to this conclusion, because the property across the street from him is zoned commercial. They zoned his residential.
So interesting.
Yes. Yes. Very frustrating. And then, you know, for us as agents, you know, we care about our clients, and it's kind of become a passion to do whatever
this
we
battle.
can do to win this battle for this man and his wife, because they've given so much to their community. But it's going to be a stretch to get this property approved for a C-store with a gas station. And then the piece I was going to add to that is that before he bought it, it was a gas station. And so you may be buying a piece of property, or you may be representing a seller on a piece of property that maybe it was once a gas station, and you've got a holding tank that was there, there has to be an EPA letter that certifies that that land is clean for future use. So a lot of things you can run into that sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we just start digging. What'd you say?
I don't want to do commercial. But here's the thing, is I think it's important because everyone here is residential agents, right? And especially in this market where there's not a lot of opportunity for buyers, right? We have less listings. So, I see Amanda is on here and she called me the other day, and I've had other people call me and go, hey, well, we're going out in this area, Dawsonville, Canton, Ball Ground or anything. And my people we're just gonna go ahead and we're gonna buy a lot and build on it. Well, you want to either buy in a developer's area,
Right.
and you're like, well, I don't want all those people next to me and everything. You just can't go grab 5 acres and say, okay, I'm gonna put a house on there. There are so many
So much.
steps. So the contract to rent land it's a real small contract.
Yeah. It is.
But man, can you open yourself up a can of worms?
And that's where it's our job to explain to our buyer, if you're representing a buyer, what's really involved, because they don't know. We're the experts. They're trusting us. And until we tell them, they have no idea. And this goes back to what we said earlier. The worst thing that could happen is you have something that you close on with a client and they go to do something with it down the road. And that was never going to happen. It's not just that it's not happening 2 years down the road because things changed. It wasn't going to happen when they closed on it.
This is why you, and Clark, you've been doing this longer than me, is that if you're in some areas that you're not the expert in, partner up. It's okay to, that referral fee that you can give to a commercial agent or something like that, and you get a little piece of, but you have none of the headaches, is the easiest, instead of you going in there and going, there's gonna be a lot of uh-ohs that you're gonna have to back out of with your client, when you could just go to them as a commercial agent, even though that might be a small deal for them, they have the expertise, because I've been in real estate and loans for a long time. When it comes to big pieces of property and everything, like she said about the loan, I mean, most people don't think about it, but if you have 10, 15 acres, right? They're gonna appraise that house based on the house and about 5 acres around it.
That's right.
They don't give you, you're not getting value for all of that, because what will happen is you're gonna have more value in the land than you do in the house. And the bank's not gonna allow that. So what they're gonna do is go, we're gonna negate all of that, and we're gonna use about 5 acres or 10 acres
Yeah.
of 100.
Yeah. So the next thing to consider is soil testing. Sometimes that's already done. So if you found a lot that is a possibility that you want to represent a seller or a buyer, then soil testing and things of that nature were done when it was developed. You may still need to do that, but it's very important. It helps the builder to calculate the depth and the kind of foundation that this particular house or project's going to require. Is it a house that needs to be on a crawl space? How thick does the slab need to be if it's going to be on a slab foundation? Soil testing is all about porosity, which is the soil's ability to absorb water or to drain, for septic systems and for structural capabilities regarding the foundation of the house. The intended use of the land will determine the type of soil testing that gets done. So this really all goes back to, if you're doing something that's residential centered for a residential client, you need a contractor or you need somebody, a builder that knows and understands, because they're going to be the one to help guide your client through this, right? This is not what we do. This is just part of the process and for us to understand. So boring can reveal if the land has rock. We've seen situations where when they bore, they basically drill into the ground and they extract a sample of soil, right? We've seen examples where they've had this beautiful piece of land, it was a large piece of land, developer wanted to develop it for a neighborhood, except every time they bored, they hit rock. That's not, you can't, that, you have to blast that. It's incredibly expensive to do that and then bring in the soil and whatever's needed in order to construct a subdivision. So that can kill a contract. And then with regard to soil, you've got texture, which is the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. You've got structure and how it aggregates together. The consistency, which refers to the strength of the soil. That makes me think of Florida, right? You know, we have these sinkholes, you know, because there's a lot of lime
That
underground.
condo that collapsed,
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
killed like 90 people.
It's awful. Soil depth is unsuitable characteristics is rock and water table we talked about. And then the soil absorption ability or loading rate. That's how quickly and how much water will absorb in a particular time, right?
And so a builder will do that,
A builder, yes, a builder should do those things because that's gonna be part of this process before
Are
he
we gonna,
designs the house.
excuse me for interrupting, are we gonna look at all at the purchase and sale?
I did not plan to do that. I'm happy at the end of this, if you wanna, I'll pull it up. Cause I know
Okay.
we're gonna, actually, we're running long now.
Okay. Thank you.
But I'm happy to do that, and anybody that wants to stick around,
Okay,
we'll look at it.
The first two things automatically, right, if you're buying a piece of land, right, and someone's gonna build on it. The first two things you ask, has there been a perk test done, right? Because that's gonna tell you a ton, and then the top of the topography,
The topography, yes.
because
You wanna know how the water drains.
because those two things are gonna tell you everything. If you, there is so much rock.
Around here.
I mean, you go up ball ground and everything, there's a quarry up there. They've been digging and taking limestone out of for 50, 60, 70 years.
Yep. Yep, and you mentioned perk test, so soil testing and perk testing is used sort of interchangeably.
okay.
There is kind of a difference, so the perk test will determine if the soil is acceptable for a septic system. If the soil will perk, then the type of septic system will be determined by the builder that needs to be put in. So they basically do the same thing, except that soil testing can determine other things like pH levels, nutrients, moisture content, etc. But the perk test specifically is going to help determine the type of septic system if this is an area where you don't have sewer. You know, as agents, we advise our clients oftentimes to do a radon test when they're buying a house. We know that radon, high levels of radon has been determined to cause lung cancer. You can do radon testing on land. Chances are it's going to have radon. We breathe in radon every day, just at a low level. The real challenge is that when you build a house on that piece of property, radon can still get into the house. So whether there's radon there today or not is not necessarily the issue. It will have to determine if it's a high level, but at the end of the day, you probably need an expert to identify what type of system needs to be installed within the home to protect against radon gas.
Do builders even do that before they buy land?
I don't think they do. I don't think that's something that they include, but I would say ask your builder, right? Because at the end of that, your buyer may want to have a radon test done on the house so it can be addressed. Because it still gets in through the walls and the concrete. Concrete's porous. So if there's radon in the ground and we know that it's really all around us, and it doesn't mean that over time that can't change, right? It may not be there today, 10 years from now, in our
You
environment
do a lot of
changes.
those big houses, you
Yeah,
know, and they're
yeah.
all fairly new.
Right, builders just
Have
put
they come up with radon for the buyers? And you're like,
Uh,
whoa, we didn't know that.
one house, the radon was kind of like borderline, 4 point something. And then builder said, we'll give you $1,000 credit, that's it. We're not going to, install a remediation system.
Right,
That most of builders do that, they just put a clause in there, they use special stipulation, say, if you find radon, when you have the right to retest, or we'll give you $1,000 or something, credit, that's it.
so in that event, it's probably good to know, what does a radon system cost? And I don't know the answer to that.
3,500, because
Okay.
one of my clients just.
Yeah.
That comes down to who has leverage, right? That negotiation is all about who has leverage. Is it the builder or is it the buyer? In this market, it's probably the builder. All right,
Some buyers don't care that much, but some care a lot.
yeah. So water and sewer, septic and well. So most of our stuff around here, right, is water and sewer, but we do get into some outlying areas where homes are built on septic. Well and septic are private utilities and water and sewer is public. That's the difference. We've already talked about the testing that's required to determine the absorption capabilities. What's interesting though about a septic system is that the calculation for the size of septic system is designed based on 2 persons per bedroom, not the number of bathrooms. Because you think about that, you might have 2 kids in each bedroom in a 4-bedroom house, and then you got mom and dad in their bedroom. So that's a lot of water, right? It's not, so the bedroom determines how much water actually gets used, not the number of bathrooms. And so the gauge is that 2 persons per bedroom usually equals 60 gallons per person for a total of 120 gallons per bedroom. So this sort of goes back to, if you're buying a piece of land or you're representing like somebody in a transaction with land that is going to be based on septic, that's also going to determine what size house can they build, because what size septic tank are they going to need based on the size of that lot.
And if it's big enough to accommodate it.
Right, that's right.
Is, Janet, is there, I've heard about new more eco-friendly septic systems that are smaller. Kind of like, I'm likening it to like, a tankless water heater.
Right,
Are you
Smaller.
familiar with any of those?
I am not.
Okay.
I'm not, so I'm not the person to, but it would be interesting to talk to somebody who does septic tanks, and it's not surprising, it's just like our technology gets smaller every year, our capacity gets bigger, and the device gets smaller every year, the space that it needs, so.
Would that be something a builder would coordinate with you as well, similar to the soil test?
They should, because if the builder is assisting with the construction of that home, yeah,
Okay,
that's in his lane.
okay.
And the architect as well. I mean, if you're working with an architect on the design of your home, unless it's something the builder's handling for you. So,
What if the client is not ready to build anything on it, they just want to buy it and hold it for years, should they get like a builder?
so I think it's really important in that situation to at least get an idea of what they think they want to do and advise them that there are limitations that can come into play. And unless they do a thorough due diligence today, and so maybe that's not figuring out a final home footprint, but it is talking to the right people to educate them about what they're going to require, size of land, if the things are there that need to be there, the utilities, the sewer, whatever. Because for example, if there's not water there and they've got to tap into well water, then that's private. They've got to drill for that, they've got to install it, and that can be very expensive. And so it's important to make sure they understand that there are some cost implications that they could be impacted by 2 years down the road. Not to mention, is it going to be a piece of land that's suitable for what they think they want to do?
Yeah,
So,
I wonder if the soil test would have to do with whether or not they could drill a well.
yeah, it could, because there can be pollutants in the ground. and they may have to address that. Y'all wanna keep going? I know we're kind of running over. Y'all wanna keep going? Okay.
Sure. No. I'm
So-
just-
You're welcome. Okay, so other restrictions that can come into play when you're working on a lot for somebody or a buyer, HOA restrictions. You can end up in an area where maybe there's not an HOA, but there can still be CCNRs, covenants and restrictions. And within those restrictions can define things like exterior finishes, size of the home that's required, garages,
Anything, right?
anything, because whatever goes on that land, if the builder thought ahead, when he put those covenants in place, he's put some language in there that's basically gonna protect the neighborhood so that somebody doesn't come along and build something that doesn't comply with the neighborhood. So it's not just about satisfying zoning guidelines, it can also be about satisfying those CCNRs or a potential HOA. And that's an important detail to share with your client as well. We don't review those documents. I would advise your client, or I would advise my client to get with an attorney. CCNRs are usually recorded in the courthouse too, by the way, at the end of the development of the subdivision. So these last couple of slides are really just other things to think about. You know, we've talked about utility access, the cost to move those utilities to that site. It's important to understand if there are future plans around this property that you're looking at that might negatively or positively impact that location. You know, that's where it helps to know what the future land use map says. Make that phone call. Other things to think about are there are easements that address views. And this can apply even in the residential world if you're selling a condo down in Buckhead that's on the 20th story, right? 20th story. You've got this beautiful view today, but is that beautiful view going to be there
Errors.
5 years? Yeah,
Who knows?
5 years from now. And it's important to understand that. So even if you're dealing with a mountain house, for example, where you've got those views that come into play, it's important to know what the guidelines are for that. And in that situation, you also have seasonal views that sort of come into play, right? It's gonna look one way in the summer and another in the winter, and is that a problem for your client? So air rights, seasonal views, we talked about landlocked property. Another thing to consider, if you're dealing with a piece of property that is zoned agriculture, there sometimes is what's called deferred or rollback taxes. So agricultural land often receives a tax exemption or a reduced tax rate on that property. And that can be referred to as deferred taxes. So when a property changes its use, the tax assessor can determine the new amount of taxes that's due. And believe it or not, tax assessor sometimes, and it depends on the municipality, can go back for a period of time. It might be 3 or 5 years. So it's important to understand if there's a deferred tax situation and who's going to pay for that. You can't just assume that the seller is going to pay for that. It needs to be covered in the contract. It's always negotiable, like everything else, right? And we know that, you know, taxes can vary depending on the type of use. You know, if it's investment property, it's going to have a higher tax rate. Wetlands, the thing I'd hit that I would say is important on these two slides, wetlands are important because wetlands are protected, right? That's where our wildlife gets its nurturing from, or its habitat, whether it's alligators, snakes, birds migrating, they need a source of water where they can stop and rest. And those wetlands are protected by the EPA. And in general, a wetland is considered to be water that covers the soil at the present time or is near the surface of the soil all year or for various periods of time throughout the year.
How would you know whether or not it's classified as wetland?
So a lot of times it's obvious, right? And this is where doing your your soil work will tell you if there's water, because maybe the water's not so visible, because wetlands don't look like marshes always. But you know, if it's a pond on that property, that's a wetland, and it's gonna be protected. So there are things to consider with that, and that the buyer may need to consider if you're representing a buyer in that type of transaction.
So soil testing would confirm or rule it out.
It'll certainly show if there's water.
Would that be defined
At the
on the
surface.
GIS map? Would that-
Yes, so that's another thing
GIS.
that the GIS often will show. Yeah, it shows natural structures, water features, yeah. But if it hasn't been tested, it could be that the GIS map doesn't show it because it's not a known wetland area. So, yeah. And then trees and wildlife. If you're buying a piece of land that has a lot of trees on it, those trees may be protected. So you have to be careful that your client doesn't have the expectation that they can just come in and bulldoze what they want. We worked with a client trying to find a piece of property up on Roswell Road, and they wanted to tear down the house that was on the property. There was a tree toward the road that would obstruct the visibility for this dental practice, and they wanted to take that down. When I called the city of Roswell, what I found out was not so fast, because there are trees that are protected and you may not be able to touch it. And I'm from Savannah originally, and the subdivision that I grew up in and that my family still lives in today is what they refer to as a canopy neighborhood. It's full of oak trees. And so when you drive down the street, there's this canopy over the road of all these beautiful oak trees and hanging moss. And my brother still lives on that street, and he has an oak tree that's on the city property, because it's true for all of us, right? Not all of our front yard is our front yard, only to the water meter. So in his case, that tree sits below the water meter, but it tears up his driveway. He can't take that tree down. They will not allow him to take that tree down. He can tear up the driveway and he can tear up the roots if he can, but imagine what that's gonna cost. And that oak tree is huge, it's been there for years. So when you're dealing with a land transaction, it's important to know that there could be trees that are protected. There could also be wildlife in that habitat that may be a protected species as well. And I'll tell you another story. They were doing the Trinman Parkway in Savannah, which was designed to run from north to south and get you through the city very quickly with just a couple of exits, kind of like what we've done with the Peach Pass. Years ago in the late 90s, when they started doing this project, and they had bought the land, and my sister and brother-in-law actually had a house that was acquired by the city so they could do this project. So they had bought the land that they needed to clear this path for this road to come through. When they started clearing, when they got to where the house was that my sister and brother-in-law had sold to the city, because they were told they had to get out of the way, they found an eagle's nest. So they had to completely reroute the path of that road to accommodate that eagle's nest. Because eagles, those nests can be like 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide, and they come back every year and make use of those nests. And we all know they're an endangered species. So just kind of a little interesting detail there. So that's a lot to take in. The due diligence checklist is pretty long. I can share that with you guys if anybody wants to see it. And then we can talk about the contract as well, if you want to look at a land contract, but just a lot of moving parts to a land transaction. So you really want to make sure that you're engaging the right people, that you're encouraging your clients to engage the right people at the beginning of the process to ensure that when you get to the end, everything is as it should be. And if you're working with a seller in particular, you want to make sure it will be very helpful for you to represent the seller, that you have a survey. And if you've researched the deed information and understand if there are any deed restrictions that will pass with the land, so that now you're educated about what you're selling, you're educated about what the zoning is and what the future land use proposes, so you can help guide your seller and not end up under a contract, because the seller can rarely get out of a contract. So you want to serve your seller well, like you would your buyer, and being educated about what you're selling. So. It's a lot.
Yeah, thank you,
Y'all
Janet.
One
Yeah.
last question, besides FMIS and Georgia MLS, where can I find residential lots?
So you can, so CoStar is something you have to pay for. That's what we use as a commercial agent. Crexi is free,
Let me spell that.
CREXI. LoopNet is free to buyers. You can look at those. And then outside of that, GIS is a good resource, so you might play around with GIS, because so many times when you're looking for a land opportunity, it's not listed. And then always driving around, right? Same as in the residential world. Something catches your eye, go look it up on Google Maps. Go from there, you might go look at it on GIS and see what you can find out about it.
You sell residential lots or land,
I do.
can I have your contact?
Yeah.
You can do-
Yeah, I'll email everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, if you guys,
Janet, this has been invaluable. This is Allison Gale online. Thank you so much. And the slides are going to be a special, wonderful resource going forward. I missed slide number 4. Do you have the capability to jump back to that so I can take a quick look at that?
Right now, you.
Right on your email, right?
write down your email.
Oh, okay, so that, okay.
Sorry.
I'll take it.
Thank you.
Is this the one? So if you
Yes,
guys,
perfect. Thank you.
if you guys want to email me, my email address is Janet, JANET.
Can you type it in the chat?
Yes. Let me get where I can see it. I'll be happy to email you guys. Okay.
So that also is good.
Still available.
Okay, there's my email address for everybody. So if you want to email me, I'm happy to share.
I'm the one who told you about the open
Presentation.
houses.
Sorry, it went a little
Yeah.
long.
When you said you don't do
Not right now. So you can do local house for the King's Cove if you want.
them. Okay, is it vacant or?
Yeah,
Okay, great.
the community.
Does anybody online have any questions?
No, right now, thank you. That was really helpful.
That's me, that's me.
Everywhere or just one?
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Y'all feel free to reach out if you have any questions after the fact. And then let's go to the dollars and see.
Big builders, just looking. Hey, that's what you know.
Good building we were too. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will. Well,
And are you planning to do that with us?
I'm coming out of town this weekend.
Oh, we should have done that past.
And, I have one open for.
You go,
St.
yeah.
Patrick's Day.
Okay. Thank you.
And, over off of Roswell,
Because we always put
but,
that on the
but maybe it's still
on the
around.
map.
Okay,
We'll see, yeah,
okay. Good, I'll make myself a note to
sounds good.
reach out to Janet. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Do you want to look at alert stuff?
Do you have it up on your?
Yeah, and I can put it up
Oh,
here.
okay.
Do you guys want to see the land purchase and sale agreement?
Hold on. Here it is.
It's on there. Does anybody online want to see the land purchase and sale agreement?
That would be good. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll go to Dotloop from here then.
Number?
404. 274. 4934.
I have trouble seeing this.
Thanks.
That's meeting you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
R2.loop. See if I remember my login information.
But you could cut down those $600 if you moved to a month, if you moved to DocuSign.
So I use DocuSign.
Do you?
I actually love DocuSign. I've been using it more lately. Yeah,
Because that's
Where
free with
is-
your, or it's included in your, some
yeah,
of those fees from.
it is. What's my password? Thanks. You're welcome. Let's see. Okay, I'm having trouble remembering my password. And this mouse is hard to work. What is it? Okay, it's not letting me in.
You know what, I'll review it.
Yeah.
I'll review it on my own.
Yeah, I pulled it up over here. She wanted to see it. So guys, I'm not gonna be able to share it online. Y'all may have to just look at it on your own, but if you go to the GAR templates, you'll see there's a land purchase and sale agreement. Are y'all good, Kathy and Susan?
I think the person who wanted to see what's going.
So let me close this out.